Welcome to all of you. We are here for another session of storytelling because storytelling is what Kanthapura is all about. As you know, we have already introduced the paper. We have talked about the historical perspective of Indian writing in English, how and this body of literature actually came about. As you all know, it is of very recent origin, and it actually took birth because of the union between two great cultures of the world, the Indian culture and the British culture, when the British took over the governance of India, which actually started in 1600. And it started basically with a small group of London merchants who were allowed to, by the Queen Elizabeth I, to come and do commercial trade in India, in the Indian Ocean, the Southeast Asia, etc. And what did they trade in? They traded in things which were probably considered, exotic in their land. Things like the Indian spices, the silk, the cotton, the indigo dye, saltpeter, coffee, and to a large extent it was opium also, and which was the cause of the opium wars. And they were allowed in the year 1600 by Queen of Elizabeth, Queen of England Elizabeth I, and they reached India. It's not as if they were the first Europeans to come to India. Before them, the Portuguese had already made inroads into the Indian subcontinent. The Portuguese, the French, the Danish, but the East India Company made its importance felt because it came with an eye to do commercial trade, but it's started eyeing the territory. Of course, it was important for them to start thinking in terms of controlling. And India at that point of time was in the most susceptible, most vulnerable state to be actually controlled, because there was not much of unity among the Indians. It was the Mughal rule was in decline, and the Indian kings were all on their own trip. Everybody is working to their own personal gains. There's a lot of infighting happening, a lot of treachery, a lot of betrayals, conspiracies being formed. So it was an easy time for the British to come and actually take hold of India. And with that, I think it's a good idea for me to share my screen with you, because uh, we will pick on my, I, just a minute. Uh, yeah, we go on to, sorry, 1 second, I'll just come back. I'll share my screen with you now, and we talk about the historical context, and we talk about certain important events which actually, what are we concerned about? We are basically concerned about knowing how exactly Indian writing came to India. It came with the arrival of the British, of course, with the arrival of the English people, and that happened in the 1612 or so. The charter was signed in 1600, I think, on 31st of December. This was the group of the merchants, the London merchants, which came to do business here. And the other significant event was the Battle of Plassey, which was fought between Robert Clive and Siraj-ud-Daulah, who was one of the Nawabs of West Bengal. He was aided by a betrayer. As I told you, that there was a lot of conspiracy, a lot of betrayal, a lot of treachery. There was not much of bonding within the Indian community at that point of time. So this person was betrayed. This Nawab was betrayed by Mir Jafar, and I'll show you a little bit of a picture. This is the picture of the Battle of Plassey, and this is Robert Clive, Mir Jafar, and the name Plassey, which I find is interesting because it is actually named after this flower called Polash. It is not actually Plassey. Plassey is the anglicized way of pronouncing a flower which was very, very abundantly found in that area where the battle was fought, which was Polash. It's a red, beautiful, parrot-beaked kind of a flower. I just thought it would include, a bit of a fun element into your lecture, because we are, after all of us are poets, and we like to discuss the beautiful things of life and what evokes emotions within us. Then we go back to the historical context, and we talk about the Charter Act of 1813, which was again another very significant point, because the Charter Act actually, according to literary historian critic Gauri Vishwanathan, I'm sure you will become familiar with her as you go on in your studies. She pointed out to the fact that it was a very significant charter, because that kind of established the assumption of the British rule of the education of the Indians. Till this time, there was a kind of a lackadaisical attitude towards Indian education. Not really any bit much, care. People were probably not much concerned about how they're being uh, educated. But with this charter, what happened was an amount of a lakh of rupees was allocated to the budget for enhancing Indian literature, Indian happiness, Indian moral instruction, as well as, so it kind of laid the path for the English to take over, to a certain extent, the responsibility of uh, the actual governance of the natives, as we were called, and the Indians were called the natives. At this point of time, I think they were being very generous, because they were saying that we need to take care of what they are being taught, and we need to take care of their sentiments also, because so that their classical, the texts, the scriptures, the religious books, the epics, etc., are not ignored, and so that the Indians do not feel threatened by this English culture which is coming forward to dominate or kind of take over. So this was, uh, apart from the fact that the British Parliament at this point of time was probably feeling a little insecure about the growing power of the East India Company officials by their very luxuriant lifestyles, and by the stories of atrocities upon the natives that was coming across to them in England, and they wanted to probably come in and intervene and actually tell the Indians where the real power lies. So this a charter was responsible for not only that, but also to release the controlled missionary action in India, because before this, the Christians could not really go about preaching Christianity and uh, translating the Bible or teaching anything about the Western classics and trying to make Western knowledge familiar to the Indians. Because again, the reason was that they didn't want the Indians to feel threatened. So there was this kind of a stronghold upon them, just some kind of, but that control was released by this charter. Now Indians were exposed to the British books, the English books, books of literature, the books of language, books of science, etc., etc., etc. So the world kind of opened up. So it's kind of set the path, set the trend for English education in India. Then we come to a very important act, which was the English Education Act 1835, and we come to the famous words of Thomas Babington Macaulay, the minutes of Macaulay. I'm sure you will all become familiar with it eventually, because it's responsible for actually, uh, kind of backtracking on the Charter Act of 1813. Because at that point of time, the Indian literature, Indian classics, ethnic, religious stuff, matter of Indians was considered important for the sentiment, for the a kind of comfort, for the comfort of the Indian people that they were governing. But at this point of time, Thomas Babington Macaulay kind of reduced Indian literature to some kind of a rubble state. He advocated for uh, Indians to be taught with the Western classics, European languages, European science, everything, because he felt that what the Indian literature comprised was not even equivalent to one single shelf of Western literature, European literature. So that was a very scathing kind of a statement upon Indian literature and Indian classics. And that kind of set the trend for British education in India. It very, very drastically changed from here on, because the medium of instruction, which used to be earlier Urdu, Persian, for the courts, for administration, etc., it suddenly changed to English. People started preferring putting their children in English medium schools, because they felt that probably there was more scope, there was more opportunity by if their children were educated in English. It opened up the world of opportunities for them. And that kind of put our young English bred Indians in a kind of a trishanku position, because they were neither here or there. So bred, brought up in English ways, but ultimately being made to follow a conventional mode of living, where they are exposed to women riding horses in England. They were suddenly asked to come back home and marry whoever their parents chose. And so that kind of contributed to a lot of confusion amongst the youth of that time. And but the fact that Indian education was being, in Indian writing in English was coming about at that point of time, because people started writing stories in English, writing essays in English, and that was also a time when gradually it's only after 1857 that after the Sepoy Mutiny, that actually the British Parliament and the monarch took over the governance of India. And it is around this time that people of India started writing stories and essays and pamphlets and poetry, etc. And that kind of brought about the the information to the outside world about what actually goes on in India. India was, as you know, we all know, India is a country of diversities. We have so many languages, we have so many religions, we have so many kinds of castes, we have so many kinds of people, and we have so many people living here. So every practice of ours, like we have so many practices which are not really, which we should be belonging to the dark ages for such practices, and those practices was much more prevalent in those times. So these practices began getting exposed to the Western world through the writings of these people. When people started talking about social reformation, people started talking about the freedom movement, people started talking about the struggles of life, people started talking about women empowerment, everything started getting written. And why? Because I think the people who were taught English, they wanted to reach out to a wider audience. We had plenty of regional writing in India, all right. But then I think this temptation to go out of the barricades and move to an audience which is larger, to see, to kind of get themselves gauged and assessed by different opinions, that probably created this body of literature. Now we come down to, I'll just show you a few pictures of our famous writers, and I have tried to include people who are there in your curriculum, like we have Rabindranath Tagore, we have Raja Rao, then we have Mashwata Devi, we have R.K. Narayan. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a text by him. We have Mahesh Dattani. I'll be teaching Final Solutions. So this is just like a tip of an iceberg. We have too many writers who write fantastically. We have to include people who have moved the diaspora, the Indian diaspora, which is doing a spectacular job writing. They stay abroad. We have names like Amitabh Ghosh, Jhumpa Lahiri, Salman Rushdie. I couldn't include everybody, so I have included a few. Now, what the point is to move to what we are actually going to talk about. We are going to talk about Kanthapura, which was a tiny village in Karnataka, and the significance of the story written by Raja Rao was the fact that he wanted to uh, not only develop a very unique style of narration in his story, because he was very particularly emphatic about the style of writing, that is the Indianness, the anxiety of Indianness is never better portrayed than in his foreword to Kanthapura, where he talks about how the telling has not been easy, the telling of your emotions, your your spirit, your culture in an alien tongue. It has not been easy, and that's what he's trying to, he talks about Indians as people who think quickly, act quickly. Maybe there's something about the sun in India which makes us very quick in our actions. And this is exactly what the story is about, because it is being told from the perspective of an old woman. Uh, it is typical of a story which is told by a grandmother in a home with all her grandchildren gathered around her. And probably she pulls out a quilt and gathers all her children to her. And she talks about the legendary history of a place that she was very fond of, that she belonged to. And that is what is significant, because he's eventually talking about the Sthala Purana. The Sthala Purana, which is the legendary history. There's no part of India which has not been touched by, mythologically, by any god. There's not a place which has probably not been visited by the gods in our epics, where probably Arjuna stopped, or Krishna gave a lecture, or Rama stopped to have the Shavari's bear. All these, every area of India has been touched by some mythological story to it. And this is what he talks about when he talks about Kanthapura, a tiny village in the state of Karnataka. And I wanted to show you a picture of a village in South India. You're probably not very familiar, so it is not. Please don't be mistaken. This is not a picture of Kanthapura. This is just any picture, a random picture that I picked up because I wanted to show you how these villages look. They have coconut trees. They have those huge, lush fields. Their houses are different. Their houses have these sloping roofs, tiled roofs, brick layered. Okay, this is another picture that I picked up. And this picture is of a river where we have a lot of descriptions of the Himavati river. When we talk about Kanthapura, the author begins Kanthapura by a beautiful description of the geographical landscape of the place. But what is significant about the story is that the narrator speaks of Kanthapura in a dismissive manner. She begins by saying that I don't think you would have heard of this village because it is too insignificant to be in the reckoning of any person, because it's too tiny. I don't think you would have heard of this place. It was high up in the hills and up the Malabar coast. And she goes on to describe how the winding routes within the jungles of, elephant infested jungles, where there are huge trees, the sal trees and the teak trees, and where at night, when they go to sleep, they hear, the last thing they hear are the turning of the wheels of carts which are carrying merchandise. If you remember, we talked about merchandise right at the beginning, which was the basic concept for British rule in India. And this merchandise she talks about right at the beginning, because she talks about how these carts used to pass through their village in the middle of the night. The last things that they would hear were the creaking of the wheels. And sometimes those carts would be loaded by stuff by their own traders, who were Subba Chetty and Rama Chetty. And their bullocks, which would be worth 350 rupees, would shake and shiver under the load which was being put upon them. And those carts would go creaking up the hill again. And where would they go? They would go to the coastal areas where the red min's ships waited for them to take away all the cardamom, all the rice, all the coffee, all the merchandise that was being carried away from our country. So there was this very important underlying of the point of exploitation of the story, which began here. The story goes on to talk about characters like Murthy. Actually, the story is about the freedom struggle and how the freedom struggle takes over the emotions and the spirit of a very bovine natured, very domesticated, very calm, serene people of a village of India. They were least concerned, least informed about what was happening all around them, and how uh, strategically they are informed and they are inspired to join this movement at whatever cost, at whatever price, to their own identities and to their own villages and to their own belongings and whatever, is what is the significant part of this story. Now this was uh, in this story, we have certain very major themes which we need to talk about. And some of the themes that I'm going to discuss today is the theme of very overriding strong theme of mythology in this story. We begin with a description of Kanthapura, where this little village is described as a caste-ridden village, because there is this woman who's describing the potters part of the village, the weavers part of the village, the Shudras and the uh, parias. Parias are the low caste, the Shudras are the parias are the outcasts, and the Shudras are the low caste. I don't know what is exactly the difference, but then she talks very clearly about the fact that the village is divided, and she makes it very evident that I'm sure you don't expect me to go and see how many houses are there in the Paria sector, because I'm a Brahmin woman after all. It's taken for granted that I'm not supposed to be walking towards that side. She, you know, right at the beginning, she tells you that the village is caste-ridden. So when she goes on to talk about Murthy, who is a very nice boy, very well brought up, single son of a lady called Narsamma. She's a widow, and this boy has been sent to the city for education. Uh, she's so fond of him that if she had a granddaughter, she says, I would offer my granddaughter to him in marriage. And she's not very happy about people, very prosperous people, coming offering their daughters, and she's very relieved where she not only she the rest of the women are also very relieved when the horoscopes don't match, because they feel that Murthy deserves much better. They're kind of smitten by Murthy. Murthy is a very nice boy who speaks softly, very deferent to ladies, and full of regard, full of respect for everybody. Unlike somebody else called Dore, who was also city bred, but then at one time he picked up a lot of stylish habits. Now, what the point is of talking about Murthy is, and about caste is, I'm talking about the fact that Murthy uh, eventually is regarded as a Gandhian. He's taken to the Gandhi ways. He's come back from the city, and he has started. Uh, there was this, they decide to. There is this ling. There's this, this shivling which they discover in the backyards of some of the houses in the village, and he, along with the other boys, decides to set up this as a tiny temple, which they call the Kanthapureshwara temple. This temple has come about only in the last 2 3 years, and this temple is used as a place where lots of religious discourses are done, lots of discussions, readings from holy scriptures. They kind of make it an excuse for people to gather together in order to read about stories. And this starts happening with Murthy's, Murthy's insistence, because Murthy is the one who actually approaches the ladies to contribute a small sum so that they can hold harikathas in the village. What are harikathas? Harikathas basically they are stories about the Lord, and these harikathas are told uh, by way of religion. They talk about, they bring in people who are going to, like, there are famous harikatha men of the cities who are invited, and they don't cost too much money, so they are given only their travel expenses and just about 10 rupees or so, and they come and they do a harikatha for the villagers, and it is supposed to be entertainment as well as religious discourse. And these ladies, these women are very excited about it. Not only the women, I'm sure the men are also involved in it, but since it is being spoken from the perspective of a woman, she talks about how quickly they finish up their cooking jobs, and they quickly move to the temple so that Ramakrishnaya will read from the scriptures on Shankara Jayanti and Ganapati Divas and Shivaratri. This starts becoming a practice because they start doing this as a ritual for every festival. Now, when this mythology is being used eventually to introduce the element of freedom struggle in India, how they decide to invite a very famous Harikatha man called Jayaram Char. And then Jayaram Char comes to talk about Shiva and Parvati, but he eventually goes on to talk about how Shiva is representative of Swaraj, because Shiva is three-eyed and Swaraj is also three-eyed, because Swaraj stands for three things. One is the ritual of self-purification, the second is Hindu Muslim unity, and the third is Khaddar, which is Khadi. And Parvati is supposed to be the woman who he seeks, and she is in penance, so she represents the country Bharat. Now, this is such a subtle way of bringing in the element of nationalism into religious discourse. Now, there are people who don't really understand this initially. There is this old lady who says that no, when I come to listen to a Harikatha, I come here to hear about Shiva Parvati and all the godliness. I'm not here. But at the end of the talk, at the end of the talk, no one is more emotionally, worked up than she, because she goes out with tears coursing down her cheeks. Now, this is a very significant event in the village, because the day Jairam Char comes and performs at uh, Kanthapura, uh, there is the presence of the police in the village. And 2 days after, there is this policeman who is set here, who's posted here in order to keep an eye on the village, because that means Kanthapura has probably gained some kind of prominence as a hotbed of controversy, or a hotbed of probably some kind of mischief happening to the colonial rule. So, and it is after this event also that Murthy is called to Karwad Congress Committee, and it is from here that he's given a lot of spinning wheels and lots of literature about the Congress, and he's asked to propagate it in every nook and corner of the village. Now, this is where mythology was brought in. This is how mythology was brought in, because mythology was used as a kind of, as a way of training the villagers, very, very naive and very, very uncomplicated minds, trying to direct them into an area of discomfort which they were unaware of earlier. So it's only through these mythological talks that they start talking about um, how there is this uh, that talk about the story where mm, Valmiki goes to Lord Brahma and complains that, do you know that your favorite daughter, Bharat, is right now is being ruled by foreign invaders, red men from across the seas. And you had endowed Bharat with so much of riches, so many rivers, so many saints, so many great kings and emperors. So much you had given your daughter, but right now, do you know that she's tied and whipped and exploited and all kinds of atrocities happening in that country? And he kind of requests Brahma to send down one of the gods to earth in order to correct the situation. And that is how the birth of Gandhi has been linked to mythology in Kanthapura. The villagers are told the story that Gandhi has come as an incarnation of Lord Shiva. The day he was born, the walls and all the streets started lighting up, and he started mouthing a lot of wise, philosophies, and he went around talking very, very, you know, important things to people. So that is how mythology was linked. It was Gandhi's birth was made equivalent to the incarnations of God taking birth in earth. Now, when we talk about mythology, we have talked about the various festivals, and most of it was directed at the women. So it is important for us to talk about women empowerment in the story of Kanthapura. Now, there are many women. I'll talk about the narrative style later, but there are many women who, it is important to talk about the women because it is spoken from the perspective of a woman. And it is important to know how women have actually been responsible for whatever happens in this small village of Kanthapura. It is the women who gather together for religious discourses to listen to the bell metal tone of the father of Rangamma, who actually reads out from the holy books, the scriptures, and he teaches, he explains all of it. His daughter is Rangamma, and Rangamma is probably representative of the modern woman because she is a devout Hindu Brahmin woman, a widow, childless. She is she's quite rich because since she has no child and she was married in a rich family, all of it is hers. So she entertains her own family who come in from Bombay and her brother's children and all that. So she is not a woman who's actually kind of holed up in a village. She's exposed to the wider world. So she, being rich, she also is a woman who reads about 5 newspapers. She subscribes to a lot of newspapers. She is the woman who actually supports Murthy in all his activities for the Congress. When we talk about women, we need to go on to talk about the role that women played in this entire story. And for that, we need to go back to the story a little because the story is all about a goddess called Kenchama. Kenchama is supposed to be the goddess of Kanthapura, and Kenchama is spoken of with a lot of fondness and affection because she is a goddess who was, as usual, it's she's gods always send saviors from the heavens above, and she came as a savior to to the village of Kanthapura because till then the village of Kanthapura had been traumatized by a demon. She came and she fought a battle with that demon and she killed it. And the place in which she killed has turned red. The mud there is red in color, unlike the other parts of the village. So all the more reason why they are convinced that the Kenchama goddess was responsible for the death of the demon. And she lives in the village after that, and she is the one who they appeal to for every problem that they face. If there's no rain, if there is drought, they come and plead to the goddess that, oh goddess, why are you troubling us so much? Aren't you, why do you want to burn our stomachs? And how I wish, this is the words of the narrator. She says, how I wish you sisters could see the gleam in her eyes and how she has a secret smile on her face when we make these prayers to her. Because middle of the night when we are all asleep, we start hearing the pitter patter of raindrops on our rooftops. So there's an element of mingling of the gods and the humans together, and it's such a realistic kind of rendition when she talks about how the river Himavati and the goddess Kenchama, a mother and daughter. So when the entire world sleeps, mother and daughter, there's the hiss of the river Himavati, which kind of implies that the mother and daughter are playing with each other throughout the night. So these are very nice kind of descriptions that is very uniquely brought through by Rajarao. And when we talk about the mythological Harikathas that were introduced in order to bring in the element of freedom struggle to the village, we need to talk about how uh, the policeman who came and started living here, uh, he was called Bade Khan, very robust, uh, rather, not a very welcome presence. So when he comes, he's posted there. So he feels it is his right to get himself a small hut or some kind of residence in the village. Of course, if it's a caste-ridden village, of course, they will not be very welcoming about somebody who belongs to the Islam religion. So nobody is very helpful. And of course, it is the police. They are not very friendly and warm towards him. So he goes to Range Gowda, who's the Patel of the village. A Patel is actually supposed to be some kind of a headman of the village, or the person who's actually in charge of collecting the revenues from the villagers. But this Patel is one of the nicest characters of the story because he is a rich man. He not only has lots of gold in his coffers, in his treasury, but he wears a lot of gold bands on his arms and waist and richly endowed. He has a 9-beamed house. He has about 3, 4 sons-in-law working for him, even though they have lots of land themselves. So he is, a very powerful man and a very kind man. He's very forgiving for people who are uh, late in their payment of the taxes, etc. And unlike another character called Bhatta, who has risen from the lowest rungs, because the narrator describes Bhatta as someone who she had seen walking the streets of the village in a dhoti, in a loin cloth, and only a lota. Eventually, Bhatta grew to be a very rich man in the village. Why? Because he started, he was a priest. Of course, he was very popular because he was always being invited for these, rituals and the priestly activities in the various homes. Apart from that, he also started, collecting whatever earnings he would get from these rituals, and he started his own money lending business. And he kind of became, for people who needed a loan, he was their help. But then he also started charging an interest, and he also encouraged them to mortgage their property, their land, their and probably to sell their stuff to him if they are unable to pay back his money. So he started, kind of cashing in on opportunities like this. And he was also uh, an important person to talk about as regards women empowerment, because his wife was a woman who would stay at home while he went around for his ritual dinners, etc. And he would come back home very fully satisfied. But this woman would be waiting for him, hungry, waiting for him. And when she knew that her husband would have had a complete meal, she would only have some kind of soup, which probably is rasam, and a little bit of rice for her child. And when she would ask him that, so they paid you 2 rupees for your work, he would be very dismissive of her, and he would say, of course they will, why wouldn't they? And he would go and store his money there. That just kind of, tells you what kind of a man he was, because he is very unkind to his wife right at the beginning. And the wife goes on to die, and he remarries, and he remarries in a very grand manner, marries a young girl, uh, hardly mature, and but he gets a lot of money from her. Okay, now we'll stop this sharing, and we will continue this in the next class. Thank you so much. We wait for the next period, and I carry on.